Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Stephen Levy, who is the main technology writer for Newsweek magazine and author of the book Hackers, which is a very interesting read. You should probably pick it up. Details on a lot of the history that led to the Boston concentration of computer security industry and the whole hacking scene and how that kind of came together. Well, give it up for Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. You folks all having a good conference? Great, great. Well, I'm really happy to be here to talk to you today. And I'm, again, I want to thank the folks at Source for inviting me, and thank you for, I hope, listening. It actually has been sort of a weird week for me. I posted this column this week. It ran in Newsweek this past weekend and ran in the Washington Post on Wednesday. And I got a lot of strange reaction from the blogosphere about it. Basically, the column, I don't know if any of you saw some of the reaction, was about how I lost my review unit of the MacBook Air that Apple had lent me. Now, which I actually have to say, I take responsibility for it, but not too much. How can you blame someone for losing something that's called Air, right? So, this is the computer. Does anyone have one, incidentally, out there? To hold it up? There's no air here? The air's out of the room? Yeah. Okay. Well, I know you guys don't put on airs, but this is the computer that you've probably seen, which is so thin that you could put it in an envelope. And my test unit, of course, my rigorous test lab, we did put it in an envelope, and it did fit. And I actually even slid it under the door because it looks small enough to slide under my office door. And I did that, and I documented by video and did the review, and was hanging on to it, doing some further testing, when I looked around one day. I wanted to take it into work, and the MacBook Air was gone. I couldn't see it anywhere. It's usually sitting by the coffee tables where I left it, so I could sort of sit with it, on my lap while I watch TV. And the power cord was there, the power brick, so I figured it must be around there somewhere. And I looked all over the apartment. It's pretty hard to locate this thing in the apartment because the profile is so thin. So I ripped the apartment, totally to shreds, couldn't find it, and sort of retraced where it could have possibly been. And I really concluded that I really couldn't have had it lost. The odds were small that it was stolen somewhere, though not impossible, because I don't remember 100% where it was. And I finally devised a theory as to what happened to the MacBook Air. Now, remember I said the MacBook Air was stored around the coffee table, and the coffee table is a big repository in my house for all the newspapers and magazines that they collect during the week, and especially on Sunday when the New York Times comes in, that the pile gets pretty big there. And this was like on a Wednesday, and I hadn't seen it for a few days, so I figured, what might have happened was these things accumulate, and at a certain point during Sunday afternoon, my wife really gets disgusted with all the clutter in the thing, and just grabs all the newspapers and magazines with two of her arms and walks it out of the apartment and down the hall and dumps it all in a big recycling bin down in the compactor room. And this is what I concluded happened to my MacBook Air. And I posted this thing, and there's been a lot of comments on this column on the blogosphere, and very few of them were flattering. A lot of them talked about what a slob I was, and I couldn't take care of things, and Apple should just get me for it. Though I have to say my employer is going to pay for it. My wife was actually pretty unhappy with the column. She insists. Well, let me put it this way: she doesn't subscribe to my theory of how the MacBook got thrown out. Fortunately, Elliot Spitzer has rescued me, because I told her, I said, listen, you might be upset that I blamed you for throwing out the MacBook, but I'm not asking you to stand beside me while I explain why I'm going to prostitutes. So, and she admitted it wasn't that bad there. And maybe my favorite comment on a blog was on the fake Steve Jobs blog. Did any of you ever read that? It's really a great blog where a guy pretends to be Steve Jobs. He's actually pretty good at it. And here's what he said. He did a posting. The headline was, Stephen Levy steals MacBook Air, claims it's lost. Stephen, you know, you could just tell us you wanted an extension on the loan, and we would have known what you meant, and we'd be okay with that. Really? Also, pick up that apartment of yours. The place is a mess. So, by the way, I haven't heard from the real Steve Jobs about the missing MacBook Air, but the first person at Apple I did tell about just couldn't stop laughing when I told her. So I'm getting a lot of ridicule from all fronts. And in case you were wondering, and with this crowd, I'll bet you were wondering, the Lost Air did not contain any off-the-record talks with Google or credit card numbers from DSL Shoe Warehouse. It did not contain the VA's master list of Social Security numbers and birth dates of 26 million veterans. So you don't have to worry about that. All that stuff is in my other computer, which I left on the train last night. And anyway, it really is great to be here in Cambridge. This is a place that has a lot of meaning to me because a lot of great things have happened here in my reporting life, and a lot of them just not far at all from this hotel. And of course, I'm talking about MIT, and in particular, two buildings at MIT, only one of which is standing now. And one of the buildings even work there. It's one of those, two 10-story towers over there with a lot of great stuff. And the other is the legendary Building 20, which you can't see because it was demolished a few years ago. Now, it was in these two buildings that a paradox was born. And it's a paradox that's something that you folks in the computer security world see all the time. And the heart of this paradox is a very charged word, and that word is hacker. So for well over 20 years, I've been involved in trying to chronicle what might be called hackerism. I'll avoid saying I mythologized it, but looking back to the origins of hackers, it does seem almost mythic. And the practice of hackers, as we know it, goes back now for about 50 years, which is kind of an astonishing number when you think about it. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let me get back to this paradox which I mentioned. And I'll bet a lot of you have thought about it. So here it is. The activity of computing becomes more valuable to people to the degree that it is open and accessible. The more open computers and networks are, the easier they are to use, the more useful they are, and the more they mean to us. So much so that because of this accessibility and openness, computers have changed the way we live and deeply changed our culture. But also, as all of you know, there is a dark side to openness and accessibility when it comes to computers and networks. Openness leads to exploitation by pranksters, thieves, spammers, snoops, and malfeasance in general. And that makes computers, of course, less pleasant, less inviting, less useful, and in some cases it makes them an outright menace. Now, you know all this, but I just stuck how profound this contradiction is. It's so solidly baked into the very paradigm of computing. It's really in the DNA of digital culture. And I think that paradox really began right here in Cambridge with the original hackers. Now, when I use the word hackers, I really have to be perfectly clear here that I'm not talking about the bad guys, and I assume you folks know about all these distinctions here. But I really am talking about the innovative wizards who may cross a line here and there, but by and large they had, and they still have, an overwhelmingly positive impact on the world at large. Now, before I talk more about the original hackers and the paradox they thrust upon us, I want to share a bit how I came across hackers in the first place. So in the 70s, and I go back a while, I was a freelance writer. And I wrote about a variety of topics that had nothing at all to do with science or computing or engineering or anything like that. I wrote about sports, I wrote about music, I wrote about murders, the usual stuff that freelance writers write about. I'd interviewed Bob Marley and Bruce Springsteen and Julius Erving, but with the exception of one story I did where I went and found Einstein's brain, which is another story I won't get into here, nothing at all about science or technology. Now, all this changed in 1981 when I got an assignment for Rolling Stone magazine to write about computer hackers. Now, what did I know of hackers at that time? Nothing. I'd never even touched the computer. But a quick glance at stuff that had been written about it, and there wasn't much, defined the term hacker in the following way. And if there wasn't this exact definition, but it all boiled down to this. Hacker, antisocial nerd, by and large a loser, who was addicted to computers. Okay, I thought I could do that story. Now, it's appropriate that I should bring up that stereotype today because in this morning's New York Times, I don't know if any of you saw it, there's an obituary of a former MIT professor named Joseph Weizenbaum. Does that name mean anything to some of you? He was best known for creating this computer program called ELIZA, which is sort of a faux artificial intelligence program where you can carry on a conversation with a computer and the computer will respond. It sort of worked like a therapist. He'd throw your statement back at you in the form of a question. But a lot of people, quite amazingly, would interact with it and tell it their secrets. And it was almost as if they were talking to a therapist. Now, Weizenbaum also wrote a book which is pretty controversial around MIT, called Computer Power and Human Reason. And it has one very distinctive passage about hackers, particularly ones at MIT. And it was one of the few things I could find when I was looking at the literature, surveying the literature, to learn about hackers before I set off doing my story. So let me read you this passage here, which is not actually particularly flattering, that Weizenbaum wrote in his book. Bright young men of disheveled appearance, often with sunken, glowing eyes, can be seen sitting at computer consoles, their arms tensed and waiting to fire their fingers, already poised to strike at the buttons and keys on which their attention seems to be riveted as a gambler's on the rolling dice. When not so transfixed, they often sit at tables strewn with computer printouts, over which they pore like possessed students of a Kabbalistic text. They work until they nearly drop, 20, 30 hours at a time. Their food, if they arrange it, is brought to them. Coffee, Coke, sandwiches. If possible, they sleep on cots near the printouts. Their rumpled clothes, their unwashed and unshaven faces, and their uncombed hair all testify that they are oblivious to their bodies and to the world in which they move. These are computer bums, compulsive programmers. Now, this is like straight out of Dostoevsky, right? I mean, you can't imagine a gloomier, more depressing group of people. I mean, Angelina Jolie should adopt them. So this is what I thought I was going to encounter when I researched the story about computer hackers. And I flew out to California because I targeted some hackers at Stanford to be the subject of my story. And before I went, I also tapped a colleague who used to work for Rolling Stone and knew a little bit about the computer world, and asked him for a list of other people I could talk to, maybe outside of Stanford. And he gave me a list of some people who were involved, I guess, in the early days of the personal computer industry, as well as some general wizards who were out there in California. So I got out there, and what I found actually blew away the stereotype. These people, by and large, were not the antisocial nerds that Weizenbaum was writing about, but I saw them almost as creative adventurers of the mind. Their thought processes were utterly fascinating to me, and I found myself learning amazing things from the way they looked at the world. Plus, by and large, they were not depressed. Well, maybe a couple of them were, but most of them were absolutely joyful at what they were doing. They were flushed with excitement about the things they were discovering, the things they were getting into on the computer. They felt empowered by programming. What's more, by pushing the envelope on computers, which were just then beginning to find their way out of the labs and onto desktops, these people were definitely onto something. Basically, it became clear to me that all of us were going to be empowered by computers, and these people were among the first to realize it. So I got really excited about these people. I wrote a story which I hope did not stereotype them in the way that Weizenbaum did and some of the other things. And I resolved right then and there that I was going to write more stories about these people and about this world. So I began a column for a computer magazine, Popular Computing, and I worked on stories for all sorts of magazines, like about things like Steve Wozniak's US Festival, which is a rock festival funded by Apple's co-founder in 1982, the biggest one since Woodstock. The development of the Macintosh I wrote about, I got in early to see that team as they developed the computer that some of you are using to this day, and things like the culture of computer bulletin boards. All sorts of thrilling things happened in the early 1980s. And of course, I got an Apple II for myself. and became an early proponent of word processing on the PC. And my girlfriend, who's now my wife, the person who threw out that MacBook Air, I think, she also got one at my insistence. And just a couple months after we got it, it was kind of funny because a computer magazine heard that she was using a computer to do her work. She's a writer also. And they ran a story called Women in Computing, and they did a full-page picture of her in there, not because she was involved in the computer industry or was programming, but because she simply used a computer, right, for word processing, and that was an unusual thing. And like now, it seems bizarre to think of it. It's almost like doing a story like women in pencils, and you would, show someone like, oh yes, this person uses a pencil. But back then, it was something pretty new and novel. So around that time, as I was writing this stuff, a publisher asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about these creatures called hackers. And that sounded good to me. I had wanted to do a book for a while. The last proposal I had circulated was going to be a study of cheesy nightclub singers. And for some reason, that didn't find favor with the publisher. So I was very eager to get to work on something and thought this would be a good idea. So I got my book contract in mid-1982. And I first began the reporting with the idea of covering two things. I thought it would be a book in two sections. And one would be sort of historical, and the other would be based on the present day, of 1982, 1983, when I researched the book. And the first section would be about the story of the Homebrew Computer Club. This was the group founded in March 1975 because the people were very eager in Silicon Valley to build the first personal computer that you can get, which was called the Altair 880, and it's this thing you could spend $500 for, and it was a kit. You put it together. It didn't do very much, but it was a computer that you could have, and this group of people was really excited about it, and among those people were Steve Wozniak. And this group really hatched the personal computer industry because people like Steve and some others started companies from it, and it really set the template for not only the personal computer industry, but for startups in Silicon Valley and a lot of other things. So I thought that would be a great way to talk about where I thought it all began, at least. And the second part would be something I thought was interesting happening at the time, which was game hackers, young people writing software that not only to please their friends, as the early homebrew people did, but did it for commercial gain, because that was getting to be a big industry, and that was something novel. So I zeroed in this company in Coarse Gold, California, called Sierra Online. So I thought I would start with the beginning, the Homebrew Computer Club, and then do the second part, talk about the consequences of success in this game company. But the more I interviewed people, the clearer it became to me the Homebrew Computer Club was not the beginning, but more like the second chapter of my story. Homebrew started the personal computer revolution, but the actual hacker culture, it turned out, and I found out the more I talked to people, had begun somewhat earlier. And the actual culture, had gone to Homebrew and then set the tone for PCs, and as it turns out, it later set the tone for the internet and the web. Now, these pioneers just didn't spring out from nowhere. They came from somewhere, and that somewhere was MIT. So a few months into my project, I realized my book would not just have two big sections, but three big sections. There'd still be a part on the Homebrew Computer Club. There'd still be the part about the game hackers writing personal computer software, and that would talk about the commercialization and things like that. But there would also be a first section, and it would turn out to be by far the most important section of that book. It's still resonant today, and that's about the hackers at MIT in the late 50s and early 60s. So that section is called True Hackers. And it talks about the people who really first used that term to refer to themselves in that way, in a very proud way. And those folks were, started off in that building I mentioned before, Building 20, and it was there, I think, that paradox I mentioned earlier really got going. So first, let me tell you about what happened in Building 20. Building 20 is actually has a fascinating history of its own. It was put up in 1943, supposedly as a temporary structure. The architect said it was designed to last for the duration of the war and 6 months thereafter. It was torn down in 1998. So it was somewhat more than 6 months thereafter the war. But as a sort of a ramshackle temporary structure, it had an advantage because everyone was very free to sort of hack the building. No one felt bad about putting a hole in the wall firewall or rewiring things or doing interesting things to it. And Building 20 hatched a lot of great things. It was the home of like the first nuclear lab at MIT and the Research Laboratory for Electronics. But it also hosted a lot of student clubs. And one in particular turned out to be the hatching ground for hackers. And that was called the Tech Model Railroad Club, which you pronounced as acronym as TMRC. Believe it or not, hackerism was born there, and it was almost like the Rift Valley of hacking there in that room in Building 20. So if you were wandering around Building 20 in the late 1950s, you might come across the Model Railroad Club, and it would be a giant room with this huge, elaborate display of toy trains. Now, I use the word toy advisedly because it was probably among the most sophisticated layouts you'd ever see. On top of the table was, as you'd expect, a very detailed, intricate train setup like you'd see in, I guess, in a department store at Christmas time, with, very detailed, little people and hills and, carefully painted trains and on a very intricate track layout. And indeed, there were people in the Tech Model Railroad Club that fussed over this endlessly, and they loved painting and getting trains and looking at train magazines and things like that. But then there was something else that happened at the Model Railroad Club, and that was the stuff that happened underneath the table. And the cohort that worked underneath the table was called the S&P contingent. That stood for Signals and Processing. And if you looked under that table, you'd find an unbelievably intricate tangle of wires and cables and transformers and even telephone step switches and crossbar executors, which were donated by a plan from a grant from the Western Electric College gift plan, Ma Bell's affiliation there. Other stuff was scrounged from a nearby junkyard. So that tangle was called the system. And the S&P group of the Model Railroad Club wired up all sorts of things that you never saw in normal train layouts. They had, you could do all sorts of weird things to it, like you could use a telephone dial to specify which part of the track you wanted to run, and several people could run different parts of the track at different times. And it really was important to these people who worked underneath the table, what you did with it over there is just how elegantly you hacked up what you could do with it. And I use the word hacked up very specifically because these people called themselves hackers. And I found this interesting because, before that, I really couldn't find people using the term in that way. And I wondered where that came from. I never got a really definitive answer, but we do know that the word hack at MIT describes a prank you pull, like, I guess, painting the dome there, or covering the dome with aluminum foil, or getting a car on top of a building, or, or doing something even more inventive. That's called a hack at MIT. And so it's partly that, and partly the idea of just like hack with an axe, because they used it in sort of a self-deprecating way, like saying, oh, I hacked on this for 12 hours. And, they use the term almost like a golf term in terms of like hacking away at something there. So I was actually able to get my hands on some of the club newsletters from the 1950s, which were pretty interesting. They talked about their hacking. And one of them even included a poem written by a TMRC hacker named Peter Sampson, who was one of the key hackers. And it was sort of in the spirit of Walt Whitman, which is kind of fitting because some of the professors actually looked like Walt Whitman back then at MIT. So let me read you one of this poem here, which gives you an indication of the flavor of the club. Switch thrower for the world, fuse tester, maker of roots, player with the railroads and the system's advanced chopper, grungy, herring, sprawling machine of the point function linolite. They tell me you are wicked and I believe them, for I have seen your painted light bulbs under the lucite luring the system coolies, under the tower, dust all over the place, hacking with bifurcated springs, hacking, even as an ignorant freshman acts who has never lost occupancy and has dropped out. Hacking the M boards, for under its locks are the switches, and under its control the advance around the layout. Hacking the grungy, herring, sprawling hacks of youth, uncabled, frying diodes, proud to be switch thrower, fuse maker, tester of roots, player with railroads, and advanced chopper to the system. So this was the kind of humor that was tossed around there of these people who called themselves hackers. And it wasn't until 1959, really, when this is going on for a while, that MIT offered the first course that undergraduates really could take in computer programming. And it was taught by a fellow named John McCarthy, who later became a very legendary figure in artificial intelligence, and did look like a little like Walt Whitman. Now, the computer they used for this class was this big IBM 704 mainframe, and it used punch cards, right? And if you remember anything about punch cards, looking around the room, I don't think many of you remember punch cards, but I'm sure you've heard of them. But it was a system that was very unsatisfactory to the hackers, because you had to write your program and give it to a technician, and a technician would then put the program onto these punch cards, which would be fed into the computer, which you as a hacker didn't get to touch. They only could touch it there, and that was quite unsatisfactory, because you really wouldn't get results back on how the program ran for like a day or two afterwards. And you wanted instant feedback, and you didn't get it. So the hackers figured, this just wouldn't do, and they figured out, how can we get more access there? And after a few months, they got their wish. Lincoln Labs donated a computer called the TX0 to MIT, and it was put in a place where the hackers could get access to it. And they were even asked to do some of the system software for the computer, and debugging and things like that. And they spent all their time there, as you can imagine. They wanted to learn everything they possibly could about the TX0. And learning about it and impressing each other with what they learned became central to their lives. Now, very quickly, as they were writing the system software and other things for the TX0, it became clear that every program, and indeed every line of code, should be accessible to all, and nothing should be considered in any way proprietary. If you knew something about the way this machine worked, you really had to share it with everyone else. That was really part of the culture. So they wrote their programs on these paper tapes, and the tapes would be in a drawer by the computer, and they belonged to everyone. Anyone could pull up the tape, and then they could work on the program, and they could improve it. And if this sounds like open source, it was. Maybe it was the version of open source there. And you would take it and you would improve it, and maybe the word would get out that you might have done it, but basically it wasn't yours. It was everyone's to work on together. So these original wizards so passionately programmed computers, they discovered previously unconceived uses for them. Now, computer time was really expensive then, so people tried in general to minimize the time the computer worked on something. But with the TX0, these hackers had more time to do things, and they did things that were normally thought of a waste of time with the computer. Like one person did something that was really the first word processor. It was a text processor. He called it expensive typewriter. Guess what? That was word processing. And someone else did a thing to do his math homework, and he actually handed his math homework in to the teacher with something he'd worked on with the TX0, and the teacher gave him an F, saying computers can't do these things. So a couple of years after the TX0 got there, a brand new company which hatched from MIT, called the Digital Equipment Corporation, was developing a mini computer called the PDP-1, and they gave the first model to MIT, again drawing on the hacker community to write software for it. And among the hacks the MIT people wrote was the famous game, maybe the first video game, called Space War. And again, it was a collaborative enterprise where people wrote different things. One person wrote something which actually arranged the stars in the background of this sort of space thing where rocket ships shot at each other in a way that corresponded to the real sky. He called it Expensive Planetarium. Again, space war didn't belong to anyone. The concept of intellectual property just didn't exist for hackers. So after spending a lot of time with these hackers and comparing the way they thought of things with the way that the later generations of hackers did, I realized that they had some things in common, sort of a shared set of principles. And I tried to set them out in this book, Hackers. I called it the hacker ethic. And the very first principle of the hacker ethic was information should be free. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that in the sense that you don't pay anything. Though, of course, that was the way things were because people just didn't pay for software then. That wasn't a commodity that people paid for. But I think that the hackers meant that once something was created, it should be available to all and distributed by any means. Free meant freely distributed with no strings attached. So a quick digression about this. My book was published in 1984. And Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Software Catalog decided to hold a conference inviting all the people in the different generations I wrote about in the book to get together. A lot of them had just never met each other. And he did this. He called it the Hackers Conference. And during one of the sessions there, Stuart kind of hacked that expression, that information should be free, by saying that information wants to be free. And that became actually a pretty popular and controversial way to describe how things work on the internet there. So that's where that came from. In any case, the free flow of information was really central to hackers when they were hacking on the TX0 and the PDP-1, and that remained so when the center of gravity in the hacking world moved across the street basically to Tech Square. That was where the artificial intelligence lab was, and that's where all the hackers actually moved from the Model Railroad Club out there when they got access to the better computers out there. And the people who ran the lab, Ed Fredkin, Marvin Minsky, really encouraged the hacker community. They did a lot of work for the place there. And it was a hacker paradise, and there were mighty wizards there, and they had very strong feelings about openness. When time sharing came into MIT, a lot of the hackers objected to it because they didn't like the computer time parceled out. They wanted a direct access. And they also didn't like the idea of accounts with passwords. To the hackers, their password, and the password they felt everyone should have, was a carriage return. That was the way to go. And their feelings about openness even extended to physical systems. They hated locks, whether the locks were on computers or whether the locks were on doors. In some cases, they had administrators at Tech Square that would lock up cabinets or rooms that held spare parts or tools the hackers felt they needed, and the hackers felt that was just totally intolerable. So they engaged in what would be known as lock hacking. Some of them even took locksmith courses to learn how to better crack the locks on doors and also to get certification to get blanks that you couldn't otherwise get. Now, one hacker at the time called David Silver described sort of the lock hacking days to me. And I want to read this quote to you because it's kind of amazing. So he said it was like an ultra highly clever warfare. There were administrators who have high security locks and have vaults where they would store the keys and have sign-out cards to issue keys. And they felt secure, like they were locking everything up and controlling things and preventing information from flowing the wrong way and things from being stolen. Then there was another side of the world, where people felt everything should be available to everyone. And those hackers had pounds and pounds and pounds of keys that would get them to every conceivable place. The people who did this were very ethical and honest, and they weren't using this power to steal or injure. It was a kind of game, partly out of necessity and partly out of ego and fun. At the absolute height of it, if you were in the right inside circle, you can get the combination to any safe, and you get access to anything. Now, he really wasn't kidding. In talking to the hackers from the AI lab, I learned a story where at one point the administrators felt they'd ramp up the security. They got a Class 2 safe, which is, maybe some of you could check on this, the kind certified for the government to hold certain kinds of classified material. And the hackers originally couldn't get through it. Then they found a similar safe in a government surplus yard out in Taunton, not too far from here. And they took that safe, somehow got it up to the 9th floor of Tech Square, and they took it apart with acetylene torches to get a better idea of how that safe worked, and eventually figured out how to open the safe that the administrators have. So it could even be argued that lock hacking got out of hand at MIT. The hackers could get master keys to everything, and of course, since they had certification, they got these blanks that people couldn't get, and some blanks are so secret that even certified locksmiths can't get hold of them, in which case they would use their keys they had to get into the machine shop and very carefully tool the master keys to the master keys. And they had a lot of keys that got into 2/3 of the doors at MIT. And once they actually seriously considered distributing a copy of these master keys to every incoming freshman at MIT, sort of as a recruiting tool to say, like, hey, come see us. We're really cool here. Now, the poor guy who had to protect things at MIT was the administrator of the AI lab. It was a guy named Russell Nofsker. And you had to feel for this guy. He actually sort of had some of the hacker gene himself. One thing he had in common with a lot of hackers, a lot of people of this ilk for some reason really love explosives. I don't know why that is. It's something else in the genetic component there. So this guy Nofsker, when he was young, he worked for a little younger, his job before, he worked for a company, it was a high-tech company, that actually allowed him to take part of his pay in primacord, which is a very high explosive. And they like to tinker with that. And once he even had an idea where he would, it was a snowy winter and there was a lot of snow on the sidewalk, and he could blow the snow away by using primacord. And his wife caught wind of this. This is sort of like a little, leitmotif in this talk, I guess, about whys. But and she put a stop to it. She made him shovel the walk. She didn't think that was a great idea. In any case, despite his very cool tendencies towards explosives loving, Novsker got very protective, when the hackers would get into things in the lab. And he kept ramping up the protection. It was sort of like Tom and Jerry, right? And, and the hackers would, then get through. Until finally, he didn't reach a solution. So he just threw up his hands and said, that he was going to stand down. The problem, he figured, was the barriers themselves. The higher he'd make them, the more effort the hackers would take to knock them down, and he'd be embarrassed, and it just go on forever. So they reached sort of an unspoken agreement where the barriers wouldn't be so formidable, and the hackers would go where they wanted. If they wanted to kind of climb through the ceiling and drop into a locked office, as they often did, and they looked around. They really wouldn't hurt things, and it was okay as long as they preserved the illusion that some people had privacy. So if you went into the office and climbed through the ceiling and dropped in and saw what was going on there, that was okay as long as you didn't talk about it to people whose offices was, and that really seemed to work. Now, it worked because it was a given that these hackers were honorable. Though sometimes their tinkering might crash the system, they weren't out to vandalize. Though they believed they should be able to see everything on the computer, they didn't take that information and abuse it or blackmail people. And sometimes the tools they used got broken in the term they used. They didn't mean for that to happen. The idea was to learn and to hack, and that's why they needed access to things, and that's why it was so important to them. Now, what I found remarkable is that some of that culture spread out past MIT, and that the culture of honor lasted really as long as it did. And what's more, the lots and lots of honorable people, call them the White Houses, are as passionate about it now as they were in those really intense days at MIT. Now, maybe the purest hacker of all that I met when I was doing the book was this guy who was, virtually living at Tech Square, and a fellow named Richard Stallman, which name might be familiar to you because he'd later go on to be the creator and the conscience of the open source movement. And, back then, he was the person who felt he was keeping the hacker flame there. So if you think about it with intellectual property, that same paradox I mentioned earlier really applies. It's great for society to have ideas and expression of ideas running freely, but it's also possible that doing so can put a lot of people out of work, like people in the music business, or even, dare I say, people in the publishing business, my business. But, it's amazing to me and refreshing to see that the views of Stallman and the MIT hackers have caught on among so many. And the hacker ethic, I'm really happy to say, really does live on. So I can't really overestimate the importance of this mode of thinking on the development of computers. It really was, I think, the hacker model that shaped the way the PC works, because, as I said before, the homebrew hackers thought the same way. And I think the creators of the internet, came out of that culture, and that's one reason why openness was really baked into the internet. And the idea really paid off. I believe because of people of that mentality were behind PCs and the internet, we really enjoy all the benefits of computing that do so much for our lives today. But, of course, we have the other side, the woes that come from that vulnerability that's also baked in there. Now, you can't pin all of that on the hackers, because some of the openness is just plain common sense. Making things accessible makes them accessible to bad folks as well as good folks. And the fact is, whereas a couple decades ago one could say the hackers were by and large honorable, it's no longer justifiable to say that goes without saying. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. So I remember when that worm began to turn. It was in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, when the term hacker became associated not so much with the kind of Weizenbaum loser or the true hackers that were heroes. I call them heroes in my book, but the kinds of people who break into computers and vandalize and cause trouble there. I think the turning point was this group in Minnesota, I think it was, that broke into some government computers there, and they were called hackers, and that term sort of stuck and caught on from there. And the true hackers were outraged by this, by how the word that they took as an honor became polluted. And I remember we had these subsequent hacker conferences that took place every year as an outgrowth of that original hacker conference. And there was one year where a reporter from CBS was there, and he was doing a thing on hackers, and he thought he was going to write about all these people breaking into computers. And the poor guy almost got lynched there, because he was misusing the term. But really, there's nothing you could do about it. Language really has a flow of its own, and it's probably as difficult to control as it is to control a movement of hackers. So this was a battle that was really destined to be lost. The term basically was just too useful to describe troublemakers and later thieves and virus makers, so it really was a lost cause. And looking back, it's sort of quaint to think that that term itself could be salvaged, especially with what we see today. These days we cope with realities like Russian hackers breaking into banks, or the Chinese government supposedly employing thousands of hackers to engage in cyber warfare and all sorts of horrible things. And if you think back to those days, you think, these are hackers? Oh my goodness, and, what's happened here? But fortunately, the real hackers, the true ones, are still around, and I find that incredibly encouraging. As a matter of fact, as I wound up chronicling in a subsequent book called Crypto, the true hackers have had an incredible role in computer security. And in my book, Crypto, I tell the story, and once again, returning to that same building, just a stone's throw from here, Tech Square, and tell the story of a guy named Whitfield Diffie, who worked in the AI lab. He was a hacker, and he really enjoyed lock hacking, but he also really enjoyed the other side. He enjoyed safes. He had a really fondness for a really good, strong safe. And he was interested in privacy, and he wanted to learn more about it, and he knew about cryptography, but was frustrated because he couldn't find out how to do sophisticated cryptography because all the good information was classified and you couldn't get hold of it unless you signed an agreement to keep it to yourself and and keep it under government control over some three-letter agency. And he didn't want to sign that agreement. He didn't want to get in bed with a three-letter agency. Instead, he just drove back and forth across the country trying to find anyone who could talk to him about cryptography because he wanted to learn more. He had this real fondness, besides safes, for dots and 510s. He would buy one after another and leave the old one on his lawn and sort of scrape it for parts afterwards. And eventually, his journey stopped at Stanford. And he hooked up with a guy named Martin Hellman, a professor there, and the two of them invented public key cryptography. And in Crypto, I talk about how public key cryptography really set the standard for private security, and again, something that the hackers were responsible for. Now, also, again, in Tech Square, three guys who, maybe I wouldn't call pure hackers, but certainly picked up on, what Diffie and Hellman did, wrote the system that most of us use to implement public key cryptography. RSA, Ravesh, Shamir, and Edelman were up there, I think it was the 5th floor of Tech Square, and that's where RSA began. So, again, all this history within a stone's throw of where we are. Now, despite public key and all those other advances, there's still a big cost in implementing these systems. No protection comes for free, and there's our paradox again. So that's why I think it is so frustrating that we have to have things like, if you lose a laptop, a MacBook Air perhaps, you won't be assured that all the information on there is going to be protected. Weirdly, we have systems that could protect it, but time and time again we hear that systems weren't protected. And that I guess says something about the trade-offs we have to deal with to get those systems to work there. People, I guess, lean towards accessibility for what's good for them in terms of they use every day, but it also leaves it open to accessibility to other folks, which isn't so good. So if you even broaden the metaphor there, that paradox is something we have to deal with as an entire society as we deal with the challenges of personal security in coping with post 9/11 terrorism. Openness and access lets society thrive, but it also makes targets soft. Too tight a lockdown, though, oppresses us and stifles our creativity and productivity. So what do? There's no easy answers, but solutions, a way that can make the problems more tractable. At least I hope there are solutions. Now, sometimes we're over-optimistic about the solutions. I remember a few years ago, Bill Gates came to visit us at Newsweek, and he said, I want to come to Newsweek because I want to talk about spam. And we brought him in there, and we gave him a cheeseburger, and he sat there in my editor's office while I interviewed him, and he told me how absolutely, hands down, no problem at all, there will be no spam by 2006. Totally eliminated. He promised me there. No problema, right? I think Bill underestimated there. And, again, that just illustrates that paradox, how we deal with spam now. again, do we aggressively filter it out and keep our maybe some potentially valuable messages in a spam filter and never see them? Or do we open up and let our inbox fill up with porn descriptions and pleas for widows who want to help us recover millions of dollars there? Now, I really wish I can come and say that I have some ideas of my own in resolving this paradox, but I don't. I hope you guys have the ideas here. My intent here was to tell you a little bit about, all the history and how that paradox was baked in, just a stone's throw from here in Cambridge, give you a sense of the history and give you, a feeling for what happened without having to buy my books there. Anyway, I'm happy to take a couple questions here. We've got just a little time, but meanwhile, thanks very much for your attention. And I'll take questions on any of this. So, is there a hand out there? I've answered everything. Come on. Okay.
Why don't you see the same thing in biology? Why aren't people in their basement? Why don't you see the hacker mentality in the DNA space or the biology space or something like that? What was special about computers?
I think, I think actually we're starting to see some of that. I'm hearing more and more about biohacking, and though the term just gets people's backs up because it does sound a little scary. But I think basically the thing about computers is that it is a total blank slate, and it is something that really a person can control very, very thoroughly, and it gives a real sense of empowerment. When you're dealing with a material, you just don't have the unlimited creativity you have when you program. You don't start with a total blank slate. So pushing around ideas really and creating algorithms is a freer arena maybe and can be endlessly hacked. Whereas if you're dealing with real stuff, I guess there's just a physical limit to what you can do. That's just a stab at it. No one else? In that case, thank you again. Have a great show.
We do have all the DVDs out in the shop yesterday and part of today.
That's right. I remember that. Well, that caused. I remember some of the guy. I don't know if you know the names of some of your elections. Got Greenblatt. Greenblatt particularly was incensed by that, and he actually thought he was one of the key models for it. So he really took it personally there. But it was interesting to think back at that stereotype, which was, incredibly unappealing, that people would draw there. There might have been aspects, okay, maybe personal hygiene wasn't one of the strong suits there at MIT, but it really misrepresented, I thought, what was an amazing part of what was going on there. Oh, thank you.